let me tell you a little bit about Erin. She's the acting curator of anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, which, by the way, has been a great community partner of ours for years and years now. And if things were different, we would be there right now in the space. She has an expertise in Southwestern archaeology and museum archives, and a PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder, SCO Buffs. Erin has worked all over the world doing her thing. She's worked in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, which is just the US, by the way, and then traveled all over to Turkey, Bolivia, Ireland, and Tunisia, but has returned quite happily to Denver and the American Southwest, where guinea pig and cat are not on the menu. She's super interested in using old museum collections. Museums have the best stuff to answer questions about the ancient past. In her other life, she is an instructor of archaeology at CU Boulder, and she teaches courses on Southwestern archaeology, method and theory, human prehistory, and her personal favorite, the archaeology of death. Currently, she is working on projects related to cannibalism, ancient witchcraft, the superlative architecture from Aztec ruins, the Toriet Lakes Great Kiva, Magic Mountain, and WS Ranch. I asked RJ to put together a slide that would just kind of last minute, that would, a good intro slide, but we couldn't get them all on the same page. So I just want to, this is Erin's face. This is another picture of Erin. And this is Erin as well, just doing her thing. We asked Erin for headshots, and she reminded me that, we don't do headshots in archaeology, so we did our best. Allow me to welcome to the stage our friend, Dr. Erin Baxter.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very, very much. Thanks, Creative Mornings, for having me, and for that great and humiliating intro. That was my own fault. But I'm really excited to be here. I'm so glad that you guys came, because I was so worried about the context of this being Creative Mornings and something interesting and fun and lively. And then I gave you the title of death, and yet you still came. So hats off to you guys. I have changed the name though, so from now on, the theme is promise, but if you ask an archaeologist to talk, often you're gonna get about the promise of the prehistory, and prehistory is all about death. But I promise I'll keep it light, nothing existential, nothing too heavy for an 8 o'clock morning. And I hope at the end for questions as well. So to start off, what is promise to you? And you guys did this a little bit in the breakout room. And I made a list, like when you're born, when a new person comes into this planet, what is promise to you? And a lot of times you get things like, you should have these sorts of things, these Maslow hierarchy of need kind of stuff. And in the end, we hope for this, and we hope to promise this, but what really is kept at the end of the day? And I think 2020 has shown us that not all the times do we get all the things that we are promised. And a lot of these tend to fade away. And Benjamin Franklin is famous for this, about what is the things that you really are promised in this world. Well, death, right? Sex, sometimes, and taxes. And we know that really, based upon this last year, we don't have to always pay taxes, or a lot of people don't. If you're under the age of 35, you are having the least sex of any generation in the history of the world, which is documented. But death is one thing that is constant. And it's something that we don't talk about, which I think is interesting as well. So who is good at studying death? Well, archaeologists are pretty good. There's other people though, so I'm not going to, stake my claim on this all. You take out your local mortician if you really want to learn some new and interesting things about practice of death. But archaeologists are good at studying death, and it's something that we're really interested in, because the human body and ancient humans are a wealth of information. And consequently, we can tell you stuff like, if you break a bone and don't get it set, that's bad. So, there's pathology and things like that. We can tell you who had really great lives and who didn't. We're good at that. We can tell you if you had ancient surgery and whether it went well or not. We can tell you that syphilis is bad before antibiotics, or penicillin. So try not to get syphilis if you can manage. We can show you that if you're a 6-year-old and you want to slow a 6-year-old down, they're all teeth. So just sort of whack them in the head. I'm just kidding, don't do that. But we look at the human body and the like. We can talk about, ancient practices where this is a site in Turkey where people were buried underneath the floors of their houses and the like, and stayed with them throughout the existence of the house. And we can tell you interesting stories about the ancient past, like this guy from 6th century Italy. He's had an amputation of his right forearm, and it got replaced with a giant knife. So, you know, before prosthetics were popular. So anyway, the human body is material and historical. We know that. And the body is sort of, you know, osteological, and we can tell lots of information about that. And that's what lots of archaeology shows are about. But it's not what I'm going to talk about today, because what I want to talk about is the culture, the time and the place and the life and the broader patterns and how it relates to all of us, not just the egghead archaeologist in the room. And to do this, we need to add in a few ingredients that I think people like at Creative Mornings are really going to be good at. And this is time, space, and most importantly, imagination, and thinking about the creative and interesting ways that people have dealt with death in the past. So if we add time and space and imagination to our mix, we get lots of really new and kind of interesting things that we can pull out and extract and learn about the promise of death in the larger world. One of the things that I tell my students all the time in archaeology is that we often underimagine the rich and extraordinary practices of the ancient past. When you look at a pile of bones, or when you look at some burned up ashes, or the collapse of a building, we don't think about the humanity of the people who were there. And I found these photos online. There's an archaeological society in some Nordic country that recreates the burials of ancient Vikings. And they find what was put into the ground with people, and they reconstruct the weapons and the jewelry and the clothing and the games and the foods and the like. And it's a really wonderful way of making you realize that it's not just sort of skeletons and distant, removed sorts of people, but it really is the life ways of ancient people. And this was somebody's family. So with that in mind, we're going to take a leap back and talk about this longue durée, this broad picture, this idea. And that is that, to start us off happily, 100% of us are die. Foregone conclusion. So we're part of a big team collective, right? Yes, this is sort of the coda funeral, right? At the end, we're all going to end up on a slab in something like this. And we know it, and we've known it for a while. But archaeologists have been struggling with how long have we known it? Until very recently, the Humans Only Club was tool making. We thought we were the only ones who did that. We know that's not true anymore. Language, and we know that's not true anymore. But until most recently, the last thing that was held up was an awareness of death. And even sort of events of the last few summers, like if you guys followed the whale who carried her baby up the Pacific coast, we know that's not true. That there are animal analogs to a consciousness of death. There are elephant cemeteries. There are great apes and monkeys who seem to have a hard time sort of letting go of deceased babies and the like. So it's not, I'm not trying to bum you out, I'm honestly, but we do know that there is a non-human consciousness, and how far back does that go? We don't know. But there's some really interesting studies going on in South Africa right now with this species called Homo naledi, who likely took their dead into a cave. And look this up online, because this cave only has parts of it only have a 9-inch hole. So they had to hire young, tiny female archaeologists to go down there and find the remains of these folks with, slack lines and tide lines and oxygen monitors and things like that. But Homo naledi, we don't think without light, with limited sort of levels of language, we're taking their dead and putting them in caching them in these caves. And that is an earliest awareness of death that I think that we know of. And that's kind of extraordinary. So how do we go from 300,000 years ago to caves to about 50,000 years ago to coffins? And what is the thinking behind that? Well, the thinking is we got a lot of thinking going on, because in the last 50,000 years, 107 billion humans have drawn breath on this planet. That's a lot of brains thinking about death and then proceeding into death. So we have all of those people have lived on this planet, and all of them have died on this planet. And we will join them at some point. But this is one of the explanations as to why, archaeologists have great job security, because for every living person on the planet right now, that means that 15 have gone before us. And that explains why in the world, in this extraordinary world that we are in, that we have these myriad and extraordinary and rich tapestry of burial practices all across the planet. They're unusual to us, our burial practices are unusual to them, but they're all practices, and they all have some consistent meaning in them, which I think is really interesting. One thing that's also consistent is the first time that humans really got together in large groups, really did stuff together, the first thing they built was tombs. They built tombs to the dead, and not just the hierarchy, the high status people. They built tombs to the dead for everyone. Here's one example. It's sort of north of Dublin called Newgrange. Another one, and while they're doing this, they're living in relatively modest houses and the like. But it was important for this sort of to fulfill this promise of death, to build something that was extraordinary and beyond the scope of what normal people were doing. Other places like Stonehenge, public service announcement, coming to Denver Museum of Nature and Science on March, so please come see us, is another place where burial was really important, sort of in early human existence. And then of course there are these rich burials that you see on every sort of National Geographic Channel and the like, and monumental architecture that grew and expanded and became localized, and a phenomena that is universal, as death is universal. And the constants of this, the promise of these, is to preserve, to transform, to remember, protect, oftentimes elevate, and to emulate these folks. And that's for, I should say, that's for a considerate burial. Not all burials are considerate, and the like, but those that when we really take the time, those are these underlying promised values to the ancient past and to death. And one example that I love of this is, anybody recognize this? This is the final binding seal on King Tut's tomb. So this is what Howard Carter saw when he opened up King Tut's tomb in the 1930s, before he saw the sarcophagus and the things, the wonderful things. But you can see that it's totally, it's never been touched since the day of his internment, and it's binding and it's complicated, and there's lots that goes into this. It's beautiful and it's eternal. And I think that's a really, really interesting look at how ancient peoples have sort of dealt with the ancient past. But it's not always constant, right? Humans are always doing weird new crap. And what changes these kinds of promises? And I was looking at your words and the like. I think it's really interesting that there are reasons that people change, but there are also constraints that we operate in. And so in anthropology, we talk about this thing called structure and agency. And I think this isn't just a thing for sort of grand theory. It's something that impacts every human in the world. And structure is essentially these arrangements that support and bind and constrain us in a lot of ways. And someone was talking about conscious and unconscious decision making. Most of the time, these are unconscious. When I talk to my students, I say, like, okay, who got up this morning and put on pants? Well, all of them did, whether they thought about it or not. That you can't say that in the pandemic. So I was trying to come up with new and interesting things that sort of structure our world. Do you stop at a red light in the middle of the night at 4 o'clock in the morning when there's no one on the street? These are sort of these underlying structures. And maybe the best example might be language. For those of us in the room who are English first language speakers, or any language, you're born into a language, right? That you have very little control over, and you are expected to learn it. But what agency is the ability to consciously modify that, to make new and interesting and sort of anti-disestablishmentarian, decisions about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And I was just reading the other day, one of the most significant agential groups in the change of modern English is not old academics, it's not music writers or anything like that, it's teenage girls are some of the most agential sort of people who change the way we look at language. But we operate within this system of underlying structure that is unconscious and we don't think about, and these sorts of pushing against it with these sort of agential changes. And a lot of times we think things that are agency really aren't, but it's a super complicated process. But I do like you to think about this in the last slides that I have. So if we take this structure and agency and we look at the long durée of death, let's bring it back to Colorado and think about the trends that are just right here in our own backyards for many of you. And for those of you who are in elsewhere, the trends are actually pretty strong patterns along the way. And that is that humans, by and large, we're running out of space. The selection to do cremation is increasing dramatically, particularly in Colorado and the western states. Inhumation and burial declining. And awareness of environmentalism, despite recent events, is actually going up. A tendency to wish to spend a lot less on our final dispensation is decreasing. And our religious beliefs, by and large, are decreasing dramatically as well. And these are sort of structured and agential sorts of things that are making our relationship with death a little bit different. And let me sort of give you an example of this. So say for instance, we can math this out, right? We know that 62 graves, we know what a grave size is. It's about 8 feet by about 4 feet by about 6 feet deep. We can take the math and we can say that 62 graves equal about an acre of land. That's the size of Hogwarts or maybe, you know, a football field. So that's for every 62 people who die, who want to be buried, that means we have to take up that much space. Well, if we look at Denver, there's this many people in Denver as of, I think, last year. This many people will die, roughly, give or take this year. And that means that we will need about 300 acres of land if each of those people decide to be interred and, you know, sort of promised a grave for eternity. That's a lot of square footage. To give you an idea of what that is, here's downtown Denver. That is the size of City Park. And that's just for this year. And then next year, we'll take Rhino. And then the year after that, we'll do downtown. And the year after that, and the year after that. And you can see that this is relatively unsustainable phenomenon. Cap Hill, that's where I am. We're done. So I know that we don't sort of like to think about this sort of thing, but it's something that it has to be sort of in the back of everyone's mind. This is why actually Colorado is really terrible about monitoring and planning for these sorts of dead. And I think, Dave, was there a poll that went up? Did we talk about this? We don't.
It's coming right now if you'd like it to.
I would love to do a poll if you don't mind to see what you guys are thinking about with far as your final dispensation. Can you take a minute or 30 seconds and just vote really quickly? And I do this with my students. So I teach at CU Boulder, and until recently I've taught about 800 students the archaeology of death, and I do in-depth polls like this as well. I also have students plan their own funerals, which is my favorite assignment to give to 22-year-olds because they hate it. And then they grow to sort of at the end kind of love it, but they really almost all don't want to think about it phase of their life.
If you haven't voted, I'm going to give you one more moment. Looks like 91 out of 106, 86%, 92. I'm going to end the poll. 3, 2, 1. Here are our results.
All right. Okay, that's actually really, really wonderfully in keeping with sort of how trends in Colorado are. Dave, thank you so much. That's great. So 67% cremation. That's higher than the national average, and it's way higher than what is happening in the Bible Belt in the southern states right now, which is almost the opposite of that. It's about 67% burial, which I think is super interesting. But by and large, that 6% of you who don't want to think about it, that's a relatively common notion as well. And there's this idea, do I have to close this poll? How do I do this? I have no cursor. Okay.
That's my fault.
No, that's fine. So there's this quote from this anthropologist who studies death. That death is the new pornography. It's something that we know is sort of around, but we don't want to talk about it. And for this reason, it's really slow to change in our culture. It's really structured in a lot of ways. And my students sort of think this way as well. And I think you guys demonstrated that in that poll. Can I have power back, Dave?
Yeah, what happened? Tell me what the deal is.
I can't advance.
Weird. I don't know. Double check.
Have a great day, Brandon.
Thanks, Mom. You too.
Okay, well, there we go. So this is sort of this changing structure is that we sort of operate, in the last 100 years or so, we've operated in traditional, modern, and sort of uber modern notions of funerals. And this has come about really, the Civil War is one of these places where we sort of mark this. And traditional burial is that most Americans, up until the last 150 years, died at home. And their family took care of the body, maybe with the help of an undertaker, and they were buried. That was 99% of Americans up until about the Civil War and just after. The first cremation happened in 1883 in Boston, and it was called an abomination by the local newspapers. And and so it's amazing that we've changed as much as we have in as short a time as we have. Modern burials, we know, are actually quite removed, where we often die in hospitals or in hospices. We're medicalized. We spend tons of money on death. It's a very expensive sort of thing, but it's the new pornography, so we don't talk about it, right? And we tend to maybe either be buried or sometimes cremated. One is going down, one is going up. And then we have sort of the uber modern, where we still die in the same place. We still want to be removed often from the last rites of death. And then we do have sort of medicalization of death and the like. We don't want to spend as much money. And there's this fluorescence of new ideas related to things like donations to science and turning into trees and being recycled and the like. So we're in this really interesting space where structure and agency are operating against one another and how we deal with the dead. And we took that example of space, but you can see these other factors, both conscious and unconscious in our worlds, that are changing this. And there's this agential pattern too, which I think is really interesting in the archaeological record. And this is my students' data, but you can see how well it's going to line up with yours. So these are folks who are in the 18 to 22 range. 90% want to be cremated. 70% first wish to be donated to science, which is an incredibly sort of generous act, and one that was actually banned by churches until, you know, a generation ago. So this is a new and really conscious pushback against structured change. 75% say no religion in their final disposition unless their mom says yes, that they need to. So they are kind of conformist in that way. And finally, they want no permanent memorial. They don't want a tombstone. They don't want a bench. They don't want a plaque. Almost all of them wish to be illegally scattered into national forests. And 100% of these 814 students say, I don't want to take up space. So whatever has happened in the last 50 years has been drummed into the newest generation of young people, that they really are aware of the ephemeral nature of their place on the planet. And Colorado is kind of at the forefront of weirdness related to this, and weirdness sometimes in a good way and sometimes not. And that is, if you want to embalm, cremate, or prepare a body for death in this state, you do not need a license, coursework, or any training whatsoever. Everyone in this room, we can start cremating people tomorrow if we have a big enough oven. I wouldn't recommend it. And lots of times we are considered the laughing stock of the funeral industry in the state. People who work here, who have funeral homes here and the like, often get licenses outside. But just do be aware of that, because there's a record number of malfeasance in this state as well, because we have no strictures on this. And that's sometimes a good thing. Oh, by the way, if you die in Colorado or in Denver, in the Denver area, you can be buried in your backyard if you so wish for, as long as you notify the authorities and realize your property value will likely decrease, and you might get dug up later because you can be disinterred later. So there's weird laws, and there's an absence of laws in this, and consequently the business of death in Colorado is actually unrestricted to a degree, and consequently we're seeing a fluorescence of creative, unusual practices in the burial of people and in Colorado. And so lots of people are sort of thinking outside the box, and I don't mean that box, I mean this box. And that is, in a sense, that burial is sort of going the way of the dodo. And one example of this is like the Denver Museum of Nature and Science with Dominique Alhambra and Steve Nash and some others have worked to do repatriation of indigenous community members who have been in museums, and to get them returned to sacred and important spaces like in Crestone, Colorado, so that museums are thinking outside the box of sort of repatriating and doing this sort of the valued thing of getting people home. Crestone is also a centered place where and it's the only legal place in the country where you can have an open air funeral pyre. And if you are a resident of that county, you can be buried out in a pyre much like this. So there is extensive sort of creative thinkings outside the box. There's this renaissance of this promise of death, which I think is interesting. And these include the only thing that's going down in practice is inhumation, is in burial for those reasons. What's going up is cremation, but you can also turn into a tree or a flower. You can be subjected to high-speed water that sort of breaks you down into your bits with water. That's legal in Colorado. You can be launched into space. It's not your whole body, it's only a little section of you, but you can go in orbit if you would so like. You can be turned into jewelry. Diamonds are popular. You can be made into a record, a pencil lead, although I don't know what happens when you get sharpened, turned into paint and turned into portrait, ash, and an hourglass, which is personally existentially terrifying for me. You can be put onto a coral reef to sort of nourish a reef. A science donation is very popular. Cryogenics, less popular. And I highly recommend Frozen Dead Guy Days if ever you have time in March. Put onto a funeral pyre, turned into fireworks, and you can be turned into ink and made into a tattoo as well. So there's lots of really interesting ways that in the last 20 or 30 years, humans are doing for the first time, as far as we know, the first time in the world. And all of that's in sort of, from creative folks in Colorado, which I think is interesting. So I'm gonna say that I promise we're all gonna die. we're going to join 107 billion other people who have died as well, and the sort of the experience that, or our own sort of rich tapestry of death practices. They're super diverse, but they are slow to change for a variety of reasons. And Colorado businesses and creatives like you guys on this meeting are at the vanguard of rapid death practice changes, which have really kind of extraordinary implications for archaeology in the future, and why we're keeping an eye on it. And also, I promise I'm done. So with that, thank you guys very, very much for listening.